You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the Dark Feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and for the month of November, we are going to look at a couple of Egyptian goddesses. As I had mentioned, we had finished the Matrika series. We've spent pretty much the whole year on Hinduism and Hindu, the Matrikas, the Mahavidyas. There are others that we could talk about, but I think, we're going to, we've stopped with that. We did the Halloween episode on the Morrigan, and now I'm going to look at take a little detour and look at a couple of Egyptian goddesses for the month of November. And in December, I'm actually going to take another detour and start looking at some winter goddesses, both in folklore and in myth, mainly from the Nordic, or at least from the Northern European. So we'll do that, and then next year is going to be a whole different exciting schedule, which we'll talk about. But for now, we're going to talk in this particular podcast about the goddess Sekhmet. Okay. Pardon me for a moment there. Sekhmet she is considered to be an aspect of either mainly of the goddess Hathor, who is the cow-headed goddess. She's considered to be a goddess of love, fertility, dancing. She's very erotic. She's kind of like an Aphrodite type figure. And she's usually seen in the form of a cow. Now, Sekhmet is considered to be her fierce aspect and often appears with the head of a female lion. So we have this ferocious goddess. She is considered to be the daughter of Ra, the sun god, and her husband is Ta, who is the creator god of the universe. Okay, so Sekhmet and her son with the god Ta is Nefertum, who is the god of healing. Sekhmet is involved with being her name actually means powerful. Okay, so she is the powerful one. Her image was used a lot by pharaohs in, when they were going to war, particularly the image of Sekhmet, or sometimes they were even said to be the direct children of Sekhmet, or there'd be statuary of her suckling them as infants. And the idea there is that, this very powerful warrior-like goddess is sort of the, has brought forth these pharaohs, who presumably also have her attributes. So again, she's very complicated in her way, but she is sometimes she's considered to be identical with Hathor. In other myths, the two of them end up separating, and sometimes too she's considered to be with the goddess Bast or Bastet, who is the cat goddess, which makes sense because if Bast has the head of a cat and she is the head of the lioness, I mean, these are, both feline associations. So it's not too difficult. Sometimes she's associated some associate her with Lower Egypt, but often I think more often than not, she's associated with Upper Egypt. Which, contrary to what your logic might be, is actually the south of Egypt rather than the north. And the reason for that is they said that, there's far more lions in the south of Egypt. So, having a lion representation there made sense. So, okay, let me see what else we want to say about her. Yes, associated with Hathor, her main cult center was in Memphis, where she was worshipped as the destroyer alongside her consort Ta, the creator, and Nefertum, the healer. She was represented by the searing heat of the midday sun. In this aspect, she was sometimes called Nesert, the flame, and was a terrifying goddess. However, for her friends, she could avert plague and cure disease. She was the patron of physicians and healers, and her priests became known as skilled doctors. As a result, the fearsome deity, sometimes called the Lady of Terror, was also known as the Lady of Life. Where have we seen that motif before? Sekhmet was mentioned a number of times in the spells of the Book of the Dead as both creative and destructive force, but above all, she is the protector of Ma'at, the balance or justice. Really, the better translation of that is living truth. and she is named as the one who loves Ma'at and who detests evil. She was also known as the Lady of Pestilence and the Red Lady, indicating her alignment with the desert, and she was often associated with the hot winds of the desert. And it was thought she could send plagues against those who angered her. When the center of power shifted from Memphis to Thebes during the New Kingdom, the Theban triad, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, Sekhmet's attributes were absorbed into that of Mut, who sometimes took the form of a lion. She was associated with goddesses given the title the Eye of Ra, which we'll talk about. Okay, so that's sort of the definition of Sekhmet and who she is. In her Hathor aspect, in her, as you know, she's considered to be an aspect of Hathor, but Hathor herself is sometimes considered to be both the mother, acting as a mother to, and also as the wife of the god Horus, okay, who was the child of Osiris and Isis. Now, the main story we have, I'm going to talk about the main story connected with Sekhmet, and then I'm going to talk about probably 3 or 4 of her attributes, and then lastly, I'm going to talk about the 7 Hathors, okay, which are the kind of the Egyptian equivalents of the Fates. And of course, I am going to talk about Hathor because she is so closely connected to Sekhmet. Okay, so first let's give the main story of Sekhmet that is known. It's not that there aren't others or that she isn't mentioned other places, but this is the main narrative associated with her as the Eye of Ra. According to myth, Ra became angry because mankind was not following his laws and preserving Ma'at. He decided to punish mankind by sending an aspect of his daughter, the Eye of Ra. He plucked Hathor, okay, now there's our connection to Hathor, from the uraeus on his brow. The uraeus, by the way, is the royal serpent. When you see the Egyptian, the pharaoh headdresses with the serpent on them, that's what it's referring to. And he sent it to the earth in the form of a lion. She became Sekhmet and began her rampage. The fields ran with human blood. Now, by the way, they don't say exactly how she attacks people, whether she's sending them, they're dying from plagues, whether she's literally physically attacking them, or whether she's burning them up, because that was another frequent thing that it would say that if Sekhmet rode by, she would burn up the flesh of the enemies. But anyway, the fields ran red with human blood. However, Ra was not a cruel deity, and the sight of carnage caused him to repent. He ordered her to stop, but she was in such a bloodlust she would not listen. So Ra poured 7,000 jugs of beer and pomegranate juice, which stained the beer blood red, in her path. She gorged on the blood, quote-unquote, and became so drunk she slept for 3 days. When she awoke, her bloodlust had dissipated and humanity was saved. In one version of the myth, Ta is the first thing she sees on awakening, and instantly she falls in love with him. Their union, creation and destruction, created Nefertum, healing, and so reestablished Ma'at. Yes, because healing is the way in which one rebalances after destruction. Okay, so this union with Ta and the union with the Creator, the Creator and the Destroyer. If I think about Hindu mythology and I think about Shiva as kind of assuming both of those roles, but if you think of Parvati as also being Kali, you can also see where she also embodies creation and destruction. So there's that fine line there, and it's not the kind of even in Egypt, which Egyptian thought I think is probably in a lot of ways the origins, a lot of the origin of Western civilization probably comes at least in part out of Egypt, because Egypt's civilization was older than a lot of what we think of as traditionally the oldest Western civilizations, like the Minoan or the Mycenaean. The Egyptians were around for a lot longer, and certainly there was Egyptian ideas, just as Persian ideas also made their way into the Greek mainstream. So this story, now does this story sound familiar at all? Now if you've listened to my Kali podcast, then you know that this is very similar. I mean, not exactly the same, but it's very similar to what happens with Kali. She's destroying these demons who are destroying the world. So again, you have this idea of corruption to the point that this negative Shakti is activated, and the goddess now is rampaging through, destroying everything in her path. And the gods can't stop her because she's in a bloodlust. Now, in the Kali story, her husband Shiva lays down in front of her, and as soon as she sees him, she stops. She comes back into awareness out of her bloodlust, and she stops. In this one, they get her drunk. So, and actually the festival commemorating Sekhmet involves everybody getting extremely drunk. It's like, what a great excuse for a party. But that was it. The way that this festival is described. Everyone drank beer stained with pomegranate juice and worshipped the mistress and lady of the tomb, gracious one, destroyer of rebellion, mighty one of enchantments. The statue of Sekhmet was dressed in red, facing west, while Bast, her cat goddess counterpart, was dressed in green and faced east. Bast was sometimes considered to be Sekhmet's counterpart or twin, depending on the legend, and in the festival of Hathor they embody the duality central to Egyptian mythology. Sekhmet represented Upper Egypt, while Bast represented Lower Egypt. Okay. Now, that central myth about her, okay, so we see her in this bloodlust. We see her in this lioness form. Now, who else have we seen in a lioness form? Narasimhi, which is the Shakti of one of the avatars of Vishnu, of Narasimha, who destroys yet another demon. And what she definitely has in common with Narasimhi is that Narasimhi is definitely... she's a hater of all things evil. Her other name is Pratangira, which has to do with the removal of black magic. So if there's any kind of, what are considered to be curses or ill dealings, Narasimhi it goes into a rage and will destroy the person who does it. Similarly, those who do not preserve Ma'at, or this living truth, will be destroyed by Sekhmet. Now, what is this living truth? I think that's something that's worth talking about. Ma'at is also represented as a goddess. And she is, and this living truth, I can compare it to the Greek concept of dike, which is also translated as justice. Okay? Now, in our very ethical way of thinking about religion and myth, the kind of didactic or moral way that we tend to think about things, I think what the original concept was, maybe, I don't want to say it's lost, but it's buried a little bit, because we tend to think of it about as, I'm preserving good and I'm fighting evil. And I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. Okay. First of all, okay, if we think about, I'm going to go back to the Greek because it's easier to grab onto in terms of the mythologies that we know and, the concept that you can kind of wrap your mind around. Dike was described as an appropriate setting of boundaries or limitations. And the ruler, or the king, their whole function really was to maintain those boundaries. It was discussed, Zeus is discussed as the king of the gods, and it's like, Zeus has a lot of powers, he can do a lot of things, but he doesn't act in certain ways because it would disrupt that divine sense of decay, that divine justice. Now, it seems to also be connected with order, with the idea of Themis in Greek myth. But at the same time, chaos is also included in it. Like there's a place and a role for chaos. So, so it's not that isn't part of it. It's not like, oh, here we have the good placid side over here, and here we have the evil chaotic side over here. They're not. They're dynamic. They work in concert with each other. And there are forces that are continually kind of spinning around, interacting with each other. And sometimes they work together harmoniously. Other times they work together, there's conflict. And this is when you might have war. If things really get out of balance or really get off kilter, then you might have a destruction and kind of a redoing of the whole thing. So if you think about those kinds of dynamics, we're not really talking about good and evil here, but we are talking about like what kind of behaviors. And I think the term preserver, which we also see associated with Vishnu, is important here. Preserving the system as it's supposed to be. And we don't always know what that is. And it's not that it doesn't involve chaos, but it does involve some kind of divine social rule, if you will, about, what's okay to do and what's not okay to do under certain circumstances. And it doesn't necessarily exclude the things that you would think. We always tend to think of morality in terms of not only right behavior, like, oh, you don't kill, you don't steal, and so on, like Ten Commandments kind of stuff. We tend to think of it that way. And also about adultery and things like that. It's not necessarily thought of in that way. In fact, one of the chief rules that the Greeks had to do with hospitality, that you welcomed the stranger. Okay, you welcomed the foreigner into your house and you gave them gifts, and the idea was that, then when you went to the foreign land, you would also be welcomed. And that was a rule that if you violated it, like the gods came down on you very hard for that. Because there's this idea of, that you, even though you have your own tribe and your own boundary, there's a certain respectful way of dealing with things that come, or people or situations that come from outside the boundary. And as later myths from Ovid reveal, sometimes you don't always know when it's the god themselves who are coming to you. So you need to always behave in that sort of more magnanimous way and not in a selfish way. It's sort of like an inherent check on sort of default human tendencies, if you will. But the idea of Ma'at is living truth. It's just living a true life according to the true way, and that's it's very complicated to describe because we always think of justice and things like that. You can think of it as actions and consequences, but it's not necessarily the strictly legal way that we think about it. So I hope I'm explaining that well enough. I'm probably not, because it's very hard to get a concrete example of what that looks like. But it does kind of relate to one of the things I really like about Hindu mythology, which is that the gods and the demons interact with each other, and it's not that they're always necessarily enemies, or that that the demons don't necessarily practice, austerities, and, they do them for different reasons. But they're both acknowledged as forces that make up the universe and that are supposed to be there. So they're actually all part of that living truth. But it's a question of when, one takes over to the exclusion of the other, when things are forced out of balance. So that's the best way I can describe it. And so this is what Sekhmet preserves. She, when you have a situation where, and it seems like you hear about this a lot, humans start out, everything's fine, and then they gradually become more and more corrupted. And it's because human behavior, we have some very noble characteristics, as I've said, and we have some really, savage and awful and what we would call psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies as well. So, there's an acknowledgement about this complexity of human behavior and having to have some kind of a, not necessarily the kind of strict moral and ethical codes that we have, but just more of a sense of, sense of equity, or a sense of fairness, a sense of, what keeps things in balance and what is good for me, but also good for the other person. And that frequently does not happen, especially when you get into larger groups, especially when you have people who are seized by certain vices like greed. It makes it very difficult. I think this is why Eastern religions tend to de-emphasize the material world, because this is where people can fall out of balance by, the balance between what they call too much and too little. So there's this concept that this is why Sekhmet exists. And that would also explain why she's related to the pharaohs in that way, because not only are they great warriors, but the idea is that they are eminently just and fair by aligning themselves with Sekhmet, and that they are hateful of anything that is not just and fair. Okay, so what else do I have here? Now, the plagues and the healing thing is interesting. The fact that she can send plagues. That makes her like Apollo, and Apollo uses those plagues usually to administer justice. Again, when there's an imbalance. For instance, at the beginning of Homer's Iliad, there's a plague that's been sent because Agamemnon wrongs Chryseis, Chryseis, the priest of Apollo, when he comes to him and makes the correct supplication to him, and then he just turns him away. And then Apollo, he prays to Apollo, and Apollo sends a plague on the Greek or Achaean armies. Apollo also sends a plague in the Oedipus myth after Oedipus has killed his father and married his mother. That's, again, something outside of the boundaries. We can also think of that as being related to the Furies or the Erinyes, because that was their way. They were very, very old. They were as old as the Titans, if not older. They were sort of Titan goddesses. And the Erinyes were there, Heraclitus had said if the sun were to move like 1 inch out of its correct orbit, the Erinyes would push it back. They're there to maintain this order, and they were particularly there to maintain order in the family. You can listen to that podcast if you want to delve into that. But the Erinyes, so in this way, Sekhmet has an aspect of her that's like the Furies. It's, when things are, or of Narasimhi more directly, because, they're both lion-headed goddesses. There's this idea that, they will savagely go after anyone who disrupts those boundaries that have been set, that are not to be traversed by humans, and in some cases not even by gods. Okay, and that also leads me to another connection there, and this is of the 7 Hathors, which are the Egyptian fates. Now, in the story of Joseph in the Bible, where he interprets Pharaoh's dream, and he sees 7 healthy kine, meaning cows, and 7 weak ones, this is a reference to Hathor, because there's the 7 Hathors that appear, and of course Hathor always appears as a cow rather than a lion. And the 7 Hathors are also the fates. They decide the fate of every Egyptian from birth to death and what kind of life they are. And if they have a soul that appears to be inauspicious, and that soul is supposed to be a prince of Egypt, they will swap it out for another soul that with a more auspicious life ahead of it, is what was believed. And thus they protected Egypt in that way. But if you think about that, if you think about the Fury, this idea of the Furies and the Fates, we also talked about the Morrigan and her connection to fate and to prophecy. There's this, so you have this sort of triad here again. You have sort of this destroyer and healer kind of motif. You have, this preserver of justice, and then you have this connection to fate. So, even though Sekhmet is not directly considered to be like dealing with the 7 Hathors, the fact that Hathor, that Sekhmet is an aspect of Hathor, does sort of make that connection there. And that does, both of those things directly connect them to the concept of the Erinyes, the idea of these female deities that are there to enforce and preserve these boundaries. Now, in Greek mythology, it's the Moirai who are the fates, the 3 ladies who are spinning, and that's also the same in the Roman. And they spin the thread of life, and they measure it out the length of your life, and then they cut it. And in Plato's view, then people drew lots to decide what kind of life they were going to have. But in any case, that's a separate discussion that you can read if you go back to the Vision of Ur and the Republic. But it's very interesting how you have these this great concern of these feminine figures who can be either who can be very monstrous, but also they can bring great prosperity in other aspects. Because, as I said, Hathor's a love goddess. I mean, she does a striptease for the god Ra when he's depressed. I mean, she's, there's definitely, there's definitely also this connection between these kinds of figures and sex. Just as Ishtar. I mean, oftentimes Hathor is associated with Ishtar because Hathor / Sekhmet has this aspect of being a love goddess, but also being a goddess of war and destruction. And you have to think about, again, what is the commentary there on the feminine, or on how females are, what the feminine with a capital F, as opposed to biological women. Okay, and I always try to make that distinction, because frequently I hear people, when we talk about the masculine and feminine, they're like, "Well, I'm a woman, so everything I do is feminine." I'm like, "No, it's not. That's not how that works." The feminine and the masculine are, these are concepts. If like I said, I always say with a capital M, with a capital F, because these are distinct, and these are qualities that both men and women have. Men and women both have masculine and feminine qualities. I know I've said this before till I'm blue in the face, but this is what it comes down to. And the feminine is something that's warlike It also has to do with desire and attraction and with sex. And interestingly, in Western religion, all of those things, are associated with things that are dangerous or sinful or, so that's why you have succubus figures, and you have the character of Lilith and things like that, that kind of portray the feminine as something to be suspicious of or to be kept under control because, you see how it is when it gets out of control, right? But you see the mythologies behind this. But see, the mythologies are not intended to make you feel like the person who wants to conquer that is the weak person, okay? If you have to eliminate everything that's scary to you, that's usually a sign of cowardice. That's not a sign of strength. That's not something, that's why in heroic ideals, the idea is that the hero confronts that energy knowing, maybe not knowing that he's weak, but he'll certainly learn it by the end of it. And sometimes there's the idea of, being swallowed by the great beast that the feminine represents. Or, or like the story of Tiamat and Marduk, I think of in the Babylonian, where Tiamat is a great serpent, but she's also the great mother of the earth. And when when Marduk slays her, and the reason that she gets angry is because the gods have gone and killed some of her, killed her lover, and she gets very, very angry, and she brings this terrifying army against the gods, and Marduk stands up and he battles her, and he ends up cutting her into the pieces, which later become the firmament of the earth. Okay, so so you have this again, this fine line between creation and destruction, and the feminine as something serpentine, or as something, that can be monstrous. In this case, we have the feminine in this leonine aspect, looking like a lion. And again, she is directly connected to the midday sun. So she's, associated, because the sun, of course, brings light and life and all of these good things, but she's associated with that aspect of the sun that can bring destruction, that can bring drought, okay, that can, burn people up, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, the things that can then kill you, having to do with heat, especially if there's no relief from it, or just, the flames of the sun turning into a scorching fire, that destructive aspect that we also see in some of the matrikas as well. So, there's this, this association, fire is always often the example given with magic, it can cook your food, it can burn your house down. Which aspect are we looking at here? But it's not that, we're not going to call fire evil because it does that. It's just, it's saying, you have to handle it with respect and with care when you use it. Okay, it's not that you can't, but you have to be, there's part of that living truth there. There's a way to handle this that's proper, and there's a way that is going to be destructive. So that is the thing to think about with forces, the forces that we've been talking about. And Sekhmet here is another one. But again, she's always acting in accordance with the divine. It's just that, with Ra, when she gets unleashed, she gets out of control because she's ingested so much of this blood, and it sends her into a frenzy, which may be, of course, a representation of how, too much of these things that we have, too much of the flesh of the world, can, if we're not careful, can send us off into that kind of, that extreme, we'll call it. I think we'll call it that. So I think that's mainly what I want to say about Sekhmet. She is, like I said, she's the wife of Ptah, who is the creator god. She's the destroyer, he's the creator, and they bring about a god of healing as their child. And then she, of course, becomes this patroness of physicians and so forth. So interesting how there's the motif there of out of destruction comes healing and renewal and regeneration. So Ptah in that way does seem to be her ideal partner. We've seen her in, her relationship to the Hathor aspect, and, how Hathor is this, this love goddess. But at some point in one of the versions of the myth, Hathor splits off from Sekhmet and becomes the wife and the mother of Horus, and turns her attention to, fertility and childbirth and things like that. And it's interesting that they say that the two of them, quote unquote, split off, as though they're no longer part of each other. And that would be interesting to kind of see when in the I'm not sure if it's the pyramid texts or the coffin texts where that appears. I have to look up the exact reference, but it would be very interesting to see if that where that break occurs, because once you start separating these aspects and splitting them up, now you're moving into a different field. I mean, I do wonder if it has to do with Egyptian monotheism, when Akhenaten decides to only have the worship of Aten and tries to get rid of all the rest of it. Now, he's not successful. Eventually, the priestly caste rise up, and these other gods, Osiris certainly he couldn't get rid of. But trying to bring these back, generally that monotheistic impulse, there's a tendency to want to separate out the feminine, to only keep the pieces of it that make people comfortable. But the other is part of it, and that's this is what Chthonia is trying to teach you to appreciate. The fact that, yes, there is this aspect, and yes, it's scary, but it does have its place, and it's a matter of showing it the proper respect, not trying to beat it under your control, because ultimately that always fails, and there's always a negative consequence to that, and that is only a move of the cowardly. People who are and to be fair to people, I mean, life is hard, and there are things we just don't want to face and would like to stick our heads in the sand and walk away from. But the reality is at some point everything has to be faced. So, we look at these realities for what they are, and so and the message is with regard to the Ma'at is that we move through our lives, we act in the way that we feel is what you might call right action. And part of that is recognizing that while we have many, many possibilities and many things that we can do, and we have lots of faculties and powers as humans, there's also places where we're limited. And a lot of times there needs to be an acknowledging of where those limits are without being resentful and without starting another war. It's because it's when we decide we need to move beyond reasonable limits that things get out of control. And again, it depends on what you're talking about. Some things may have no limit, but there's a lot of things in life that, once we get a taste of one, then we decide, that was like the myth in Hindu mythology of Raktabija, the seed of desire. Once you've had one, once you have one and you think you've destroyed the one, 100 others come up where that one, left off. It's something that just continually goes on and on and on until it's checked. And in these mythologies, it's usually checked by an angry feminine figure who either devours it, swallows it, or just flat out kills and destroys it in some other way. So these, so that overextension, that overgreed can lead to that feminine devouring, that destruction that time has. Excuse me. So that's all I have for this week. And next time we're going to talk about what are we talking about next week? Let me look at my list. Taweret, who is the hippo goddess, who is associated with protection, particularly protection of children in ancient Egypt. So we will talk about her in the next episode. In the meantime, I would like to thank all my Patreon listeners. And if you would like to become a patron, there's going to be a lot of cool stuff coming up. I do some free giveaways. I'm going to be launching the Chthonia Learning Channel soon. In fact, I might have already launched it by the time this podcast is live. And if so, there's discounts on classes. At the very minimum, there's early access to these podcasts, which are posted on metapsychosis.com. And there's all of this, there's going to be, like I said, when I have new books and stuff coming out, patrons are the first ones to know about new things that are going on, and are the ones who are going to either, get discounts or get free stuff, and also extra podcast episodes and things like that, usually done for the YouTube format, because that's just the easiest thing to do with Patreon. But there's all kinds of extra stuff. So if you want to become a patron, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. To see a summary of all of my work that I do here, go to chthonia.net. If you are interested in any of the sessions that I do in my liminal Reiki practice, which I talk about on Chthonia.net under related services, but I also have a separate website called liminalreiki.com. And even though I talk about tarot and Reiki there in particular, I actually do a combinations of things. Sometimes I bring in astrology, sometimes I bring in other oracles, sometimes we do what they call, amplification, mythological, looks at things, looking at dream work and stuff, whatever the person happens to need. But in short, like the whole system is there to try to help people move through transitions, difficult ones, crises, or feeling in the void and not knowing what to do next. It's not meant to be a therapy. I'm not a counselor, but it can help people kind of look for the guide signs, see what's going on, and see what they can do to potentially rebalance that energy. It's not a substitute for therapy or anything like that, but it is something else, another service that a lot of people have found very helpful. There is a testimonial page on liminalreiki.com, so you can see what people have had to say about their services with me. And right now, everything's virtual, so it doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to be living in my town or near where I live to have these services. You can, right now I do everything through Zoom or WhatsApp or whatever method you prefer. I can, do these, and and I took a number of test cases before I took this to add to my offerings. But everything that I do in distance has been shown to have a really positive and profound effect. So, so if that interests you, please check that out. Visit me on social media if you do not, if you just like this and want to keep up also and don't want to get involved with the other, or maybe you do, or maybe you want to do all of it. Check out Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I'm listed as Chthonia Podcast, just one word, on Twitter and Instagram, and as Chthonia Podcast, 2 words, on Facebook, and also I'm Chthonia, just Chthonia, on YouTube. So check me out wherever. Like I said, on Instagram I do daily tarot readings, but I also we'll post when there's a new podcast out, just as I do to the others. And sometimes I post a few other, little things here and there if there's an update. So once again, thank you for joining in and listening. I hope you'll continue to join me for these podcasts, and that, feel free to post comments, ask any questions. And if you're on YouTube, please subscribe. The more subscribers I have, the better it is for me on YouTube. So wherever you want to do. And of course, if you're somewhere, you can also leave a review of this podcast. What do you think? Well, every little thing that you do helps me be able to move this forward and be able to devote more time, money, and energy to the whole endeavor. So again, much appreciation to those of you who have done work with me and been patrons or otherwise helped me so far. And with that, I will see you in the next episode.